traditional exchanges do more in this space, but also people playing around with different ideas a little bit about how we could have a credible price, which is based on physical transaction or auction-like prices. Still early days there yet, but there is definitely evolution of thinking about how to price some of this stuff.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities, and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, where trading in centrally cleared, physically deliverable LNG and carbon futures contracts is now underway. Ready for smarter markets?
Welcome back to Markets in Transition on Smarter Markets. I'm Dave Greely, Chief Economist at Abax Technologies. Our guest today is Andy Holm, Senior Metals Columnist at Thomson Reuters. We'll be discussing the many transitions happening in the metals markets today and the big issues that the metals industry needs to be talking about if we're to meet these challenges as we head into London Metals Week. Hello, Andy. Welcome back to Smarter Markets.
Hey, Dave. Nice to be back. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's nice to have you back. And when I was thinking about this podcast series we're doing, Markets in Transition, the metals markets really came to the forefront of my mind. So I'm really glad to have you here to share your experience and insight. And, some of the transitions that have been unfolding in the metals markets have been driven by big events external to these markets. We've had the sanctions on Russia, battery metals demands driven by the energy transition to a lower carbon economy, which is in turn creating these competitive tensions between the United States, Europe, and China over the production of these critical minerals. And all of these are increasing the demands we place on the metals markets and placing strains on them, requiring them to change too. So I'd love to talk through some of those with you. A lot of them you've been covering in your reporting over the past year. And maybe we could start with the sanctions on Russia, because even though the invasion of Ukraine happened a couple years ago and is still going on, this isn't an old story. This week, you covered Russian President Vladimir Putin's suggestion that Moscow should cap exports of titanium in retaliation for Western sanctions. And I believe he made a similar suggestion about nickel last week. How are these sanctions still affecting the metals markets today? And how have markets and market participants had to change their trading practices?
Okay, so you're right. Let's go back 2.5 years or so to the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So what you've seen in the interim period is really Western sanctions on Russian metal. The US has led the line on this and pretty much banned most base metals, most industrial metals from entering the United States. Europe has sort of followed in its wake. What we haven't really had up until now is counter sort of measures from Russia itself, right? And I think the comments that were made, I think they were made last week and widely reported in Russia. So it was one of these, Mr. Putin holds his sort of open studio sort of conferences, if you like. And he suggested that his ministers might want to consider capping exports of strategic metals to the West. And he mentioned 3. He mentioned nickel, he mentioned titanium, and he mentioned uranium. What has Russia got in common for all 3? Of course, it's a big producer of all 3. And they are 3 sensitive points for, I think, many Western countries, yeah? So, funnily enough, there was a great threat of this happening right at the start of the war. So you cast your mind back, right? To 2022. Think what happened to nickel. The threat that Russia would stop exporting nickel to the Western market really generated what became the monster rally that became the monster short squeeze that resulted in the LME sort of suspending its contract, right? It didn't happen, though. So here we have the suggestion coming again. And I think the reaction, actually, nickel, for example, is very telling about what's happening in the nickel market, right? 2.5 years ago, monster rally as the threat of losing Russian supply. This time around, the price, it blipped up a little bit. It went down a bit. It was a sort of collective shrug of the shoulders. And, that just says, well, look, this nickel market landscape has been transformed in that period of time, 2.5 years, right? What the market's saying now is, hey, if you stop shipping nickel to us, we don't care. Because this has been going on. Indonesia has not only been ramping up huge amounts of nickel production capacity, but it is now exporting, and its Chinese partners are exporting refined nickel to the LME. So really enough, Indonesian and by proxy Chinese refined production of nickel has simply displaced Russian in the market. This premium class 1 99.8% nickel that trades on the LME that the Russians were such big producers of. Yeah, there's 5, new LME brands of Chinese nickel meeting those standards and the first Indonesian one. So that for me was a fascinating case of I guess you could stop cap exports of nickel. The market doesn't care. The market is in oversupply. Okay. The second one on its list, titanium, is a much, much more interesting case, right? Here's an interesting fact for you. The only country that has imposed sanctions on Russian titanium is Canada. Europe hasn't, and the United States hasn't per se, right? Why is that? Because the Western aerospace industry, this is what we're really talking about with titanium metal, goes into making our airplanes, right, both civilian and military. It's still at least partly dependent on raw titanium products from Russia to this day, right? So guess what happened when Canada said, hey, we're going to sanction all this stuff, and any supplier that's using it, and that may be a Canadian manufacturing company supplying Boeing. Reuters reported that Emmanuel Macron himself personally intervened with Justin Trudeau and said, no. We need some waivers on this for our Airbus suppliers. And you know what? He got it. And that tells you that and some of these metals were not at a state yet, even after 2.5 years of sanctions and war, that we can simply cut off, right? I'm not going to get into the uranium. Obviously, his comments on uranium has sparked a whole different conversation in that market. I regard that more as an energy material market than metals, right? So, titanium remains extremely sensitive to that loss of supply, I would suggest, from Russia. That's why you saw political interventions at the highest level against the Canadian sanctions. And the European Union has still not obviously got any sanctions against Russian titanium. That tells you quite a lot about where the supply chains for Boeing and Airbus are getting some of their material at least.
Yeah, and I want to come back to the nickel piece as well, because I think it's a great movement into talking about some of the impacts of the energy transition, because there's this energy transition to a low carbon economy, increasing the demand for copper and battery metals like nickel, lithium for electric vehicles. And I wanted to ask you, because that production response that you referred to out of Indonesia, out of China, was so large in the beginning and really kind of changing the landscape. I wanted to know, how do you see the energy transition affecting metals markets today? And how do you think we should expect them to be affecting it in the future?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Let's go back about a year or so in time, maybe 2 years in time, and we would have this conversation, right? And everyone was super bullish about the battery materials. Everyone's super bullish lithium. Everyone's super bullish nickel. Everyone's super bullish cobalt. If he goes into a battery, we were all super bullish, right? Look where the prices of those commodities are now, right? Nickel is bombed out to the point that Western producers cannot make money at these prices. The lithium production landscape is kind of like a war zone. So many people have had to defer contracts, defer new plants, investment, or they're winding down, they're even closing plants because lithium prices are so bombed out. Cobalt's exactly the same story. So how have we gone from super bullish to super bearish landscapes, right? We discussed nickel, it's a 2-year scenario. And I think a couple of things have happened, right? Obviously, let's go with the supply. Everyone's super bullish. What do? They pump money into new capacity, right, all over the world. Obviously, there's going to be a shortage of lithium. There's going to be a shortage of nickel. There's going to be a shortage of cobalt, right? So we've seen, obviously, with the time lag of getting new plants up and running or new mines operating, this year has seen, a huge supply come on. It started last year, right? Just at the time that things have started changing on the demand side, right? And there's been a lot of real doom and gloom out there about end of the EV revolutions, sales slowdown in electric vehicles. I think the answer is a bit more nuanced than that. Look, the energy transition of the vehicle fleet is kind of progressing still at a super fast rate, yeah? Maybe not quite as fast, as it was a couple of years ago, but it's happening. But here's what's changed, right? 2 years ago, I think the debate was binary. Either we're going to have internal combustion engines or we're going to have battery engines, right? The consumer has decided that there's a third way. He wants, or she wants, a hybrid, a plug-in hybrid. You look at what's happening in China, which is still the world's largest market for new energy vehicles, right? Pure electric battery vehicles have seen a dramatic growth slowdown. Plug-in hybrids are just going crazy as a part of the market, yeah? And I think in the West also, a lot of people have decided that they're very comfortable with this as a stepping stone technology, right? But here's the thing. The batteries in them are smaller because obviously you've got a petrol engine in a hybrid as well, right? Some of the older ones are probably still even using lead acid batteries from the old, manufacturing process. That's where I think the real dent has come. That was not really expected by anyone to happen, right? You go and look over the last even 3 or 4 months and look at all the major car companies around the world saying, hey, maybe we're going to slow down the battery electric production and maybe we're going to ramp up hybrids because the customer really seems to like hybrids. This applies even more so in China than it does in the West. This was completely unexpected. By the way, they don't use any cobalt. So that's one of the reasons cobalt's crashed out. There's no cobalt in a hybrid battery system. There is nickel, but again, the battery itself is smaller, less nickel, less lithium in it, right? So I think that's what's going on. And that is the nature of all revolutions. And this is a revolution, right? To try and sort of decarbonize the world's fleet of vehicles. It never goes smoothly. It's always going to be a bumpy ride. This was a big unexpected bump, but it's one of those things. I guess the customer is always right in the automotive industry. If that's what guys want to buy, that's what guys are going to make, right? But it doesn't mean that, we've come to the end. Oh no, this is the end of the EV story. Not at all. It's just that there's this transition technology, original internal combustion to pure battery, that is kind of like turning out to be much bigger and more important than we thought. And by the way, don't write off platinum and palladium and catalytic converters either, because guess what? Hybrids use them. So the mix of metals used in this revolution is constantly sort of got a changing dynamic. And again, depends, in this case, customer choice and or new technology, right?
And so we've got China changing the demand mix because of what consumers want. And that's, you said being reflected increasingly outside of China as well. You've got China increasingly dominating production of these critical minerals with Indonesia. And I'm curious, when you look at the production side of what's happening in China on a lot of these metals, how do you see that affecting the metals markets today?
As is often the case in industrial policy in China, when battery vehicles are declared the thing to invest in, what you almost always see is massive overinvestment in production capacity. And we've seen it in aluminium in the past, we've seen it in steel in the past. This is just the way that economy works, right? If the word goes out, battery manufacturing plants are now being supported by your local government. That means easier finance from the banks. You and I, Dave, would be rushing out to sort of find some of the guys. This is the way China works. You always have to factor in this overproduction and excess capacity cycle, right? I think one of the things that we've seen, for example, in lithium is a massive overdevelopment of their own pidolite resource, right? Which is high cost, makes sense when the price is high, much less sense when the price is low. We've just seen some closures in that part of the Chinese production sector, right? To some extent, you're seeing the same. In nickel, albeit the whole thing is offshored in Indonesia. Massive overproduction. You build too much capacity too quickly, guys, right? And to be fair, I think the Indonesian authorities have kind of grasped what's happening here. And you see the tightening of new mining licensings being granted in 2024, say, relative to the last couple of years. So it's the Indonesians are trying to apply the brakes to this. As I said, for me, it's a classic Chinese, sort of investment policy. They build too much capacity, and then the idea is, well, over a period of time, the weak will fall by the wayside, and then we'll do a bit of mergers and build some national champions. I think the problem is compounded, though, in the battery materials, because these are markets, they're still growing up really fast, right? 10 years ago, lithium was priced directly between producers and consumers. It was regarded as a bespoke product. It did not have a mechanism for producers or consumers to hedge forward, right? And I would argue that if you look at this boom-bust cycle that lithium's been through, particularly, at least it's part down to the fact is you don't have a financial sort of framework within which to handle your investment flows, right? Basically, you've gone blind. You just sunk a lot of money by digging a hole in the ground or like developing a new brine lake, but you've not hedged production. You couldn't hedge production because there's no mechanism of doing so. That is just starting to change, right? But I think that's really compounded the issues in lithium. We can also have that conversation about nickel. One of the reasons the London Metal Exchange contract blew up is you had a huge surge of production at that stage in the wrong form of nickel to be delivered against the LME. But again, you get that mismatch of who's producing what for this revolution, what can be traded, how can it be traded, and is there liquidity for it to be traded, right? And cobalt also has come from being a niche market, again, very bespoke, sort of like, a very small traded market to something much bigger. These metals are still catching up in terms of their pricing mechanism, and that adds, in my opinion, to the volatility, and that adds to this kind of concept of boom-bust cycle. You've been following commodities as long as I have. We know what happens next in lithium, right? At some stage, they're going to misjudge another surge of demand. Guess what's going to happen? It's going to have another boom here, right? And that's been the cycle for the last 10 years. It's a new industry still trying to gauge its own demand profile, yeah? And it's difficult because that demand profile is moving all the time, yeah?
That's a great way to put it. It's investment kind of going blind when you don't have that kind of forward curve to kind of look out and say, this is where some prices are. I can start to see where I'm investing. I can see where I'm able to hedge my risk. The markets, investors, producers, consumers, they just need to kind of, as you said, walk a little bit blindly. So we need to make the improvements in that.
And it's important for sustainable financing in this sector, right? It's like if I came to you and I said, can you lend me $1 billion? What are you going to do with that? I'm going to build a copper mine. And we had no way to hedge that. Would you give me $1 billion?
Of course not. Not even if I had it.
To go and dig a huge hole in the ground? Of course you wouldn't. No one would. No banker in their right mind would say, well, I'm giving you all this money to produce something. And we don't know what the price is going to be. I think this is one of the issues. You've also had stop-start financing. It's because we simply haven't an adult market framework within which to allocate capital correctly, if you like. Hence the boom-bust scenario we're having at the moment.
One of the demands we've been putting on the market that doesn't even have these straightforward pricing mechanisms, the desire to be able to price green premiums for producing metals in environmentally responsible ways. You've written a number of times that remains elusive. Why do you see that green premium remaining elusive? Is it simply the lack of mechanisms, or is there also the lack of willingness for consumers to put their money where their beliefs are?
Yeah, no one wants to be the purchasing manager who buys the expensive material, right? But no, the more fun. It does vary a lot depending on which metal you want to talk about. Let's talk about nickel, for example. This is where we've heard a lot about the green premium. Partly because, of course, Western producers want to find a way of differentiating their production against Indonesia, right? And I would agree. On moral grounds, if I want to buy an EV, I do want my metals in it to come from environmentally responsible sources. Our problem is, what's even green nickel? What is green nickel? Comes a bunch of very smart guys, an outfit called Benchmark Minerals Intelligence, I attended one of their online webinars about this. They can identify about 70 factors that go into making a metal green. Put it this way, most producers in Indonesia don't tick any of the boxes. We can talk about the high carbon footprint. We can talk about the deforestation. We can talk about the handling of tailings. We can talk about health and safety. So there's been several bad incidents at some of those nickel plants, right? Where do you start when the world's biggest producing nation itself doesn't know where it is? And a lot of the Chinese companies won't disclose anyway. That's one of the big hindrances. Even if I, as a buyer, want to find green nickel, I don't have sufficient disclosure from too much of the world's production to even make that choice, right? I think some of the Western producers are getting wise to this and are looking at full traceability, which I think may be one issue. The easiest way you could approach green nickel would be carbon footprint, because Indonesia is also very high carbon footprint. They're coal powered for the most part. But it doesn't really resolve your issues around, say, what about the deforestation where you built this mine? Look at other metals, it becomes slightly easier, I would suggest, right? So when you look at aluminium, which tends to be produced in Western nations because it needs a lot of power to generate, its biggest impact, is the emissions itself produces. Therefore, the lowest emission aluminium could be generally said to be relatively green, yeah? That's a one-dimensional issue, right? We don't cut down forests to build aluminium smelters. We don't displace people, right? I think in copper, again, I think copper may be where green premium is most advanced as a concept. And that may come down to also it has a high recycling component, which can be very green indeed, right? Nickel is simply not there. And such as the growth of Indonesia as the world's biggest producer, through, frankly, there's a bit of an ESG horror story at one end of the spectrum, what's going on there. It's just really hard to know what's green and what's not green. Till you kind of understand what you mean, who's going to pay a premium? The industry itself has a lot more to do. Now, I am fully aware that the Indonesians are fully aware that this is an issue for them, right? They are, I think, belatedly trying to sort of like get their own traceability programs going from mine to smelter, et cetera, et cetera. But obviously, they built so much capacity in the space of a couple of years that we've only just started at the beginning of the journey, I suspect. Other metals becomes easier, yeah? When you look at aluminium, one of the problems here we have is that one of the largest producers of low-carbon aluminium is, of course, Russia. Which brings us back to our first point is, well, we really don't want to be buying Russian aluminium, do we, guys? It's a really complex universe at the moment. So I do have a lot of sympathy for buyers who really are trying to sort of like understand their supply chains, yeah? I think a consumer company like Apple has led the way, but let's be blunt about it. Apple doesn't use as much metal as, say, Ford or General Motors, right? So it has the luxury of being able to sort of look at quite small quantities of metals and then look at like a recycling options to source those in a way that some of the bigger users, simply don't have that luxury at the moment.
I think listeners will have noticed throughout this conversation that talking about metals is really talking geopolitics as well, right? It's Western producers, it's China and Indonesia, it's Russia. Of course, this week there's a new effort by the US and Europe, headlines that they're trying to join forces to break China's grip on critical minerals. The US has been trying to support its own critical minerals production and security for some time now through the Inflation Reduction Act programs. And I wanted to ask you, what do you make of these new efforts by the US and Europe? And how do you see them affecting metals markets?
A man of my age grew up in a world where geopolitics was defined by energy, by oil, more than anything else. As we decarbonize and we switch away from oil, we can only do so by using metals. So maybe we shouldn't be surprised that geopolitics is still energy, but just energy metals now. Listen, I think there's a three-pronged tactic here from the likes of the United States. The first is obviously to use tariffs wherever possible to keep out material from China and other hostile nations, if you like. The second, obviously, is massive investment in domestic supply chain. And the third is to team up with like-minded countries, I would call it an italic NATO, to sort of try and woo third countries to supply us, not them, as it were. You've hit a really interesting thing about where the investment is going in the United States. They're trying to create a supply chain, and in some cases from scratch. That means build the mines, right? Build the power plants, ESG compliant mines. Then you've got to build, smelters to treat it and refineries to treat it, and then guys to sort of make it into a raw product. I think that's kind of like variable success factors, and it's part of that chain. So one of the issues you have, and a lot of money has been sort of like granted towards, building new mines, lithium and nickel. But that money doesn't sort of resolve the problems you have bringing a new mine on, which are quite often environmental opposition, maybe Native American Indian opposition, because it may well be on their land, right? You have the whole pile of money and we're ready to go, but that doesn't sort of help you through permitting process, which is notoriously a long time frame in the United States. So yes, you look at the list of projects that are due to receive it, these are good projects, but each one of them has its own environmental sort of opposition dimension. The more interesting part of the US investment is probably going into the bit that we don't discuss so much as we should do, which is really, can you change demand? So maybe we can't produce enough lithium or enough nickel, enough cobalt to make this sort of battery, but maybe we should allocate money to research facilities to say, make us a different battery, please, one that we could be using in 10 years' time. And I think that could, obviously, really generate good rewards for a relatively small outlay. I also think a gradual build out of recycling capacity is another part of the US investment program where little money can take you a long way. I think the most difficult bit is building new mines and new smelters. Even though we all accept the need that ideally, we would like to have these for our own sort of like security or supply, there's a lot of folk out there who will picket every sort of meeting you have to say, not in my backyard, right? Weird enough, the places where the money will have early and probably better and longer lasting success is the bits we don't really discuss about. It's the bits going into research. It's the bits going into guys looking at new ways of making batteries, making new applications and thinking differently about how we use the materials, yeah? Europe is, by the way, is a way behind the United States on this. Don't be surprised. There's 27 countries that have to be corralled into sort of agreements on anything they do, right? But in principle, they do have recognized that they have to sort of do more. And recycling, again, same rules apply. You look at sort of Rio Tinto, which has found a fantastic lithium deposit down in Serbia, right? 2/3 of the country, I just read in the poll, are against development of that mine. So you can throw as much money as that project and subsidy as you want. But if you cannot persuade the Serbian people to have it, it's probably not going to happen. But equally, sort of that sort of money, you put it into an existing recycling sort of like a circuit to make it more efficient, yeah, you could start moving the dial that way. But I think both the US and the Europe have realized, in the time frames we're looking at here, we're going to need some help from our friends. Friendshoring is the new hot word here. And you get some fascinating sort of like flashpoints developing around the world as we try and compete with China or loosen China's grip on a resource it already has. I would cite DRC, the Congo, which has a lot of cobalt, has a lot of copper, and even has a lot of lithium. And there's a fascinating sort of great game being played out there at the moment, I think, right?
This is why I love talking with you, Andy. Thinking of a hockey metaphor, if we need to be skating to where the puck is going, not where the puck is, right? Like thinking about getting into recycling. What's the next generation of batteries instead of trying to, take what'll be a decade plus build out to get to where the market currently is.
That's why I think is, as I said, the under-discussed component of the US federal investments here. That makes complete sense to me. Let's not just be, we need this much lithium, we need this much nickel. Let's look at whether we do in 10 years' time, in 15 years. That's where, as I said, the awards are not so substantial. They don't grab the same headlines maybe as sort of like X gets so-and-so to sort of like, there's so much money to build a lithium mine, whatever. It's a full supply chain concept going on here. And I think that's where the US is more thought out than maybe people give it credit for. Because getting new mines up and running in the States is still a really hard thing. However much money you kind of like throw at the project, if the locals don't want it, you probably shouldn't build it.
And I wanted to move from geopolitical flashpoints to market flashpoints. You had brought up earlier in the conversation, the nickel strains and the chaos on the LME when Russia first invaded Ukraine, the spike in nickel prices and everything else. When you look at all these demands that are being placed on our metals markets right now and all the strains, are these changes that are happening in the metals markets, where do you see the pressure points and where might we have problems next?
Well, I think we're in a better position in terms of financial framework, if you like, than we were a couple of years ago. There are now pretty liquid, fully functioning and trading sort of cobalt and lithium contracts on the CME, which is something we didn't have a couple of years ago. There is obviously lithium pricing is still tends to be dominated by an exchange in China, but at least we have a credible alternative now. I think also one of the things you're looking at, lithium's a great example. I think it's fair to say that traditional lithium producers have not exactly rushed to open the door to sort of exchange pricing of their product, right? The whole thing is we don't make a commodity. We make something bespoke. It's chemically unique. It's not a commodity. Problem is the underlying price behaves like a commodity, my friends, right? So I've seen one producer in particular is trying a different pricing mechanism, and they're doing it through an online trading platform. And essentially is basically like tendering specific sort of parcels of material, whether it be raw material, carbonate, hydroxide, and using that, the awards of that bidding process, if we can get enough traction on that, you could create an index which is actually based on your product, your non-commoditized product. So I think there's experiments like that going on. I'm completely agnostic. It may work, it may not work. Something similar is happening on nickel. We talked about the green premium. There's another outfit called Metals Hub, which is allowing grade 1 nickel to be transacted on its platform. And in some cases, if the producer wants to put ESG credentials on it, that will trade as well. If it trades at a premium, that will be picked up again. So I think you're starting to see both traditional exchanges do more in this space, but also people playing around with different ideas a little bit about how, could I have a credible price, which is based on physical transaction or auction-like prices? Still early days there yet, but there is definitely evolution of thinking about how to price some of this stuff. Maybe just a simple exchange price is not enough. Or maybe an exchange, let's say, look at the London Metal Exchange, the LME does grade 1 standard nickel, if you like. If you want premium, if you want to get a premium for your green product, you will not achieve it by selling it basis LME, but you might achieve it in a physical marketplace or an electronic marketplace. And I think that's sort of a very interesting development, one to keep an eye on. I watch and wait myself with interest to see whether any of these ideas will really catch on.
And of course, London Metals Week is this week. So thanks for taking the time to be with us ahead of it. And I just wanted to ask you before you go, what do you think the industry needs to be discussing and preparing for if our metals markets are to navigate all these transitions we've been discussing well?
We're talking about the London Metal Exchange. So the first thing the LME needs to sort out is itself, as usual. Several weaknesses, I think, in the LME way of doing business were revealed by the nickel crisis of 2022. The LME, to be fair to it, has taken several measures to sort of particularly to prop up that contract. But I think one of the bigger issues the LME has, and I wrote about this recently, is the LME has a surprising share of its own liquidity. The way that this Victorian market has slightly strangely evolved, I mean, it's a prompt date market. You can trade any day between here and 3 months forward. Business is structured not directly into a central, electronic marketplace, but can come via 2 tiers of brokers. What is found, and it found during the nickel crisis, is when he was trying to understand who was doing what in his own contract, too much of what was being done was taking place in dark liquidity pools, sitting right close to the LME, but not on the LME, operated by many of its own members, right? So, a dark pool is a dark pool. It's called that for a reason. You can't see into it. So the LME is kind of going on this drive to say, come on, guys, really, if you want to trade here, we really, really like you to trade on the central electronic venue, if possible. Let's try and capture more liquidity. So that's a very specific question for the LME itself. As always, the LME goes its own path on the rest of the world. I think broadly, the market's kind of been a bit shell-shocked this year. We had a huge monster rally in the second quarter led by copper. The whole thing there spectacularly unraveled. I think the first and foremost thing is people want to get a sense of where they are. Like some of the stuff we've been discussing, Dave. I mean, what actually is going on in the battery sector, right? Who is winning? What materials are doing well? Are we producing too much nickel? Are we producing too much cobalt? Are we not producing enough for something else? These very basic questions are still big questions, in this revolution, right? There is an issue around geopolitics as well. So like, what happens if, what happens if Russia stops all of its exports? I don't think it will happen. What would happen if it did? What would happen if China stopped some of its exports? They've given enough warning signs for some of the minor metals. Yeah, they threw antimony on the list of, maybe you need us to check who you're exporting it to, right? So I think all that's going on as well. Really, next week, I think this will be a case of the market will come in a confused state of mind to LME week and be seeking some sort of clarity on what on earth is going to happen to just the price of copper. Just something as basic as that. What do we actually think here is going on? Is copper, a buy here? Is it a sell here? And I'm not sure the market at this moment in time is completely sure of the answer to that. And I would expect maybe some sort of resolution. This is not what normally happens during LME week. Somehow, amid all the cocktail parties and the champagne, people come out feeling either, hey, maybe we should sort of be a bit bullish here, or the other way around. Let's see what happens this year. I guess bullish, if I had to say. The energy transition hasn't stopped, but it's just not gone the way people thought it would go. And China also remains a big, big question mark in its own right. It's still the biggest consumer of most of these metals. Working out exactly where China is at the moment is a whole different set of problems.
Thanks again to Andy Holm, Senior Metals Columnist at Thomson Reuters. We hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll be back next week with another episode of Markets in Transition. We hope you'll join us.
This episode was brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, where trading in centrally cleared, physically deliverable LNG and carbon futures contracts is now underway. Ready for smarter markets? Contact us at onboarding@abax.exchange. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abax. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abax Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.